They married for money. They loved in secret. And the secret would not stay buried. In the gilded houses of the American rich, marriage was a contract of name and fortune, and love was something you bought quietly and hid behind a locked door. For 5 women, that hidden love broke open in gunfire. A famous architect shot dead in front of a theatre full of people. A robber baron bleeding out on a hotel staircase. A gambler slumped dead in a moving cab. A minister and his choir singer laid side by side in a field. A director face down in his own parlour. 5 killings, 5 women at the centre of them, and one truth the money could never hide. Money could buy a marriage. It could not buy silence. If you want the true stories of the women who stood at the centre of America's power, its scandals and its secrets, subscribe to Feminine Legacies, so the next one reaches you the moment it goes live. Chapter 1. The Most Photographed Face in America. Before she was 16, her face was already selling soap and sheet music to a country that did not know her name. It looked out from magazine covers and calendars, from cigarette cards and chocolate boxes, from the windows of photographers who paid her a few dollars a sitting and then sold her image 1,000 times over. The country was in love with a girl it could not name, and the girl behind the face was often hungry. Her name was Florence Evelyn Nesbit, and she was born in 1884 in the small town of Tarentum, Pennsylvania, outside Pittsburgh. Her father was a lawyer. For a while, the family lived in the comfort of the professional class, with books and a piano and the expectation of better things. Then, when Evelyn was still a child, her father died, and the comfort died with him. He left behind debts instead of savings. The house went. The piano went. Her mother, with 2 children and no trade, discovered what the American economy of the 1890s offered a widow with no money and no husband. It offered very little. What followed were years of moving and boarding and falling behind on the rent. The family drifted to Pittsburgh, then to Philadelphia, chasing work that never quite held. Her mother took in sewing and clerked in a department store. Evelyn, still a girl, went to work beside her. And somewhere in those thin years, in a photographer's studio in Philadelphia, someone looked at the face of this quiet, dark-eyed girl and understood that it was worth money. This is the first thing to understand about Evelyn Nesbit. Her beauty was not a private gift. It was the only capital her family had. In a world that gave a woman almost nothing she could own outright, it was the one asset that could pay a landlord. And so, very young, she was put to work being looked at. An artist saw her first, then another. In Philadelphia, she began to model for painters and illustrators, holding a pose for hours in exchange for $1 or 2 that went straight home to her mother. When the family moved to New York around the turn of the century, the small trade became a flood. New York in 1901 was the capital of American image-making. Its magazines, its advertising, its illustrated weeklies devoured pretty faces, and Evelyn's face was the kind the era had decided to worship. She sat for the most famous illustrators in the country. Charles Dana Gibson, the man whose drawings had invented the ideal American girl, posed her with her long neck curved and her hair falling into the shape of a question mark, and called the drawing The Eternal Question. It became one of the most reproduced images of the age. She sat for the photographers whose studios lined the avenues, and her likeness spread across the country on postcards and in the pages of every magazine that could afford her. She was, by the measure of sheer reproduction, one of the most photographed women alive. Consider the scale of it. She was earning as a young teenager what many grown men did not earn in a year. A single successful illustration could be printed in editions of hundreds of thousands. Her image appeared on advertising calendars that hung in tens of thousands of American kitchens. Photographers paid her a few dollars for a sitting and resold the prints for years. She supported her mother and her younger brother almost entirely on the money her face brought in. She was the family's whole income before she was old enough to marry. Then came the stage. The theatrical producers who ran Broadway understood that a famous face sold tickets, and they wanted hers. In 1901, she joined the chorus of a hit musical called Florodora, and soon after appeared in another called The Wild Rose. She was placed in the front line of the chorus, the row nearest the audience, because managers knew that men bought seats to look at her. Night after night, the wealthiest men in New York filled the good seats and trained their opera glasses on the same young girl. And here, the story turns from fame to danger. Because the chorus girl of 1901 occupied a strange and perilous place in American life. On stage, she was a goddess. Off stage, she was assumed to be available. The men in the good seats did not see a working girl supporting a widowed mother. They saw a commodity that could be bought with a supper, a bracelet, a promise. The same beauty that fed her family also marked her as prey. She was 16 years old, earning a living by being looked at, in a city full of rich men who believed that looking gave them acclaim. Her mother, exhausted and frightened and out of money, was in no position to guard her. When powerful men began to take an interest in Evelyn, her mother sometimes saw it not as a threat, but as a rescue, a chance for her daughter to be looked after by someone who could afford it. That was the arithmetic of a poor woman in 1901. Protection and predation wore the same evening coat, and it was almost impossible to tell them apart until it was too late. So picture her at the edge of the story that would make her the most famous woman in America. A girl of 16 with a face the whole country knew and a bank account that held whatever was left after the rent. She had learned already that her beauty was power of a kind, the power to earn, the power to be wanted, the power to walk into a room and stop the conversation. What she had not yet learned was how little that power protected her, and how much richer and more dangerous the men who wanted it were. There is a kind of photograph that captured the whole strange machine she was caught inside. The photographer Rudolf Eichermeyer posed her reclining on a fur rug, her dark hair loose, her eyes turned toward the camera, and gave the picture a soft and pretty title that hid exactly what it was selling. It was reproduced everywhere. A girl who owned almost nothing had become an image owned by everyone, printed and sold and pinned to the walls of homes in towns she would never see. And the people who grew rich from that face were never Evelyn. They were the photographers, the publishers, the advertisers, the theatre managers. She received a few dollars for the sitting. The image earned for years. The world she now moved through carried its own dangerous glamour. After the final curtain, the chorus girls of Broadway were drawn into the supper clubs that lined the theatre district, the gilded restaurants the newspapers called the lobster palaces. At Rector's and Sherry's and Delmonico's, the wealthiest men in New York held court over champagne and late suppers, and a lovely young performer could be introduced, admired, and pursued. This was where the front row of the chorus met the front row of society. It was presented as harmless amusement. It was, in truth, a marketplace, and the goods on offer were girls like Evelyn Nesbit, still in her teens and already famous, with a tired mother who could not always be there to stand between her daughter and the men with the money. One of those men was about to send a carriage for her. He was the most celebrated architect in the United States. He had designed the very building where she would one day watch a man die. And in his hidden apartment, high above a street in the 20s, he kept a swing hung on red velvet ropes. The girl whose face sold a nation its magazines was about to be handed to him, and the whole country would eventually hear exactly what happened next. Chapter 2. The Architect and His Velvet Swing. Stanford White was 47 and married when he first sat a 16-year-old girl on the red velvet swing in his hidden apartment. He was, by 1901, one of the most powerful men in New York, and almost no one who mattered would have believed a word against him. To understand what Evelyn Nesbit walked into, you have to understand how large Stanford White loomed. He was a partner in McKim, Mead and White, the most important architectural firm in America, the firm that was busy rebuilding the face of the nation's cities in marble and limestone. White himself had designed the Washington Square Arch. He had designed mansions for the Vanderbilts and the Astors. He had designed churches, clubs, and monuments up and down the eastern seaboard. And he had designed Madison Square Garden, the vast pleasure palace on the east side of Manhattan, with its tower modelled on a cathedral in Spain and a rooftop theatre where the fashionable came to be seen. He was a giant of a man, red-haired and loud and magnetic, a lover of beauty in every form he could buy or borrow. He collected art, tapestries, furniture, and women. And he had a particular and predatory taste for very young girls from the chorus lines of the theatres he frequented. This was not entirely secret among the men of his circle. It was tolerated, the way the appetites of powerful men were tolerated, as a private matter that money kept quiet. White kept several private spaces for his pleasures, apartments and rooms scattered around the theatre district, paid for and furnished in secret. The most famous of them sat above a stretch of West 24th Street. Inside, behind an ordinary door, he had built a world designed to overwhelm a young girl. There were rooms hung with heavy fabric and lit low. There was a mirrored bedroom, and in one room, suspended from the ceiling on ropes wrapped in red velvet, there was a swing, positioned so that a girl seated on it could kick her feet toward a paper parasol hung near the ceiling. He met Evelyn through the theatre, as he met all of them. He arranged an introduction, then an invitation to a luncheon, presented as harmless, chaperoned, respectable. He was charming and grandfatherly and enormously reassuring to a girl and a mother who had never met a man of his standing. He won the mother's trust. He gave the impression of a wealthy protector, taking a fatherly interest in a promising young performer. He even paid for things, a better place for the family to live, medical care, small securities that a poor family could not refuse. And then, on an evening when her mother was away and Evelyn had been brought to his apartment, the fatherly mask came off. By her own later account, given under oath before the entire country, White gave her champagne. The account she gave was that the champagne was drugged, that the room began to spin, that she lost consciousness, and that she woke in the mirrored bedroom to find that White had raped her while she was insensible. She was 16 years old. He was in his late 40s. He was one of the most respected men in America, and she was a chorus girl whose word, in 1901, was worth almost nothing against his. What she described was, in the plain language of our own time, the drugging and rape of a child. It must be named that way, because the era did not name it that way, and the way the era failed to name it is part of the story. There was no framework in 1901 in which a wealthy, married architect could be publicly accused of such a thing by a 16-year-old model and be believed over his own reputation. The power was entirely on his side. His money, his fame, his marriage, his circle of influential friends, all of it formed a wall that her word could not cross. For a time, the relationship continued in the shadow of that first night. White kept her close. He paid for her mother to travel. He installed the family in better circumstances. He continued to see her, and the red velvet swing became, in the later telling, the symbol of the whole arrangement. A plaything in a gilded room where a powerful man kept a girl he had taken. When the story finally reached the newspapers years later, it was the swing that the country fixed on. The image was too vivid to resist. Evelyn Nesbit became forever the girl in the red velvet swing. Here is the scale of the imbalance, in the plainest terms the era offers. White commanded a firm that designed buildings worth tens of millions of dollars. He moved among families whose fortunes ran to hundreds of millions. He sat on the boards of clubs that decided who was admitted to society. Evelyn earned a few dollars a sitting and a modest weekly wage in the chorus, and every cent of it was spoken for. On one side of the ledger sat almost unlimited money and reputation. On the other sat a teenage girl and her widowed mother. That was the marketplace in which her beauty was traded. And yet, even here, at the point of her deepest powerlessness, something was being created that would one day become a weapon. Because the story of what Stanford White had done, the champagne, the mirrored room, the swing, the unconscious girl, was a story only Evelyn could tell. For now it was buried, a private wound and a private secret. But secrets like that do not stay buried in the houses of the rich. They wait. And this one would wait for another rich man to come along, a man even wealthier than White and far more dangerous, a man who would become obsessed with Evelyn Nesbit and with the story of what had been done to her. The measure of Stanford White's power is worth laying out plainly because it explains why a girl's word could not touch him. His firm was the most sought after in the nation, its buildings rising in every great American city. He had a hand in the design of libraries, of the great marble arch in Washington Square, of mansions in Newport for families whose fortunes ran into the hundreds of millions, of the private clubs where the men who ran New York gathered to decide things. Madison Square Garden, which he designed, rose in 1890, crowned by a tower that stood among the tallest points in the whole city, topped by a gilded statue of the goddess Diana that turned in the wind high above Manhattan. He kept private rooms in that very tower. He was not merely wealthy, he was woven into the stone of the city itself. And he did not act alone. White moved in a circle of rich men who shared his appetite for the girls of the chorus lines, who treated the theatres as hunting grounds and the young performers as a renewable supply. There were dinners arranged for the purpose. There were apartments kept for the purpose. There were introductions traded quietly among men who understood one another perfectly. A girl who entered that world at 16 was entering a system built by powerful men to serve powerful men, a system in which her youth was the attraction and her poverty was the leverage. Evelyn Nesbit was not the first girl Stanford White carried up to the rooms above 24th Street. She would simply become the most famous because of the man who would one day kill him for it. His name was Harry Kendall Thaw. He had $40 million behind him and a mind coming loose at the hinges. And he had already begun to hate Stanford White before he ever laid eyes on the girl who would give him his reason. Chapter 3. The heir who bought her silence. The next man to want her had $40 million and a hatred of Stanford White that had already curdled into obsession. His name was Harry Kendall Thaw, and he was the kind of man that great wealth produces when it is poured into a weak and cruel vessel with no limits placed upon it. Harry Thaw was born in 1871 in Pittsburgh, the son of William Thaw, a coal and railroad baron who had built one of the great industrial fortunes of the age. The family money came from the arteries of American industry, from coke and coal and the railroads that carried them, and by the time Harry reached manhood, the Thaw fortune was reckoned at around $40 million. That was a sum almost beyond comprehension in the 1890s, when a working man counted himself lucky to earn $500 in a year. William Thaw understood that his son was unstable, and he tried, while he lived, to keep the money away from him. He held Harry to a modest allowance, hoping to curb the young man's appetites. It did not work. Harry gambled, drank, and travelled through the pleasure districts of American and European cities, leaving a trail of complaints behind him. There were stories, quietly settled with money, of Harry Thaw's cruelty toward young women, of whips and closed rooms and payments made to keep the matter out of the papers. The family's wealth existed, in part, to clean up after him. When William Thaw died in 1889, the restraint died too. The will left the 22-year-old Harry $3 million of his own. His mother, Mary Copley Thaw, who adored her difficult son and could refuse him nothing, raised his monthly allowance to $8,000. Consider what that meant. $8,000 a month, at a time when a schoolteacher might earn $50 in that same month, and a labourer far less. Harry Thaw had, every 30 days, more spending money than most Americans would see in a lifetime, and no work, no discipline, and no restraint to spend it on. Into this life came the face of Evelyn Nesbit. Thaw saw her, as thousands of men saw her, on the stage and in the magazines. But where other men admired, Thaw fixated. He began to pursue her with the relentlessness of a man who had never been told no. He sent flowers by the armful. He sent notes under false names. He arranged introductions. He pressed money on her mother. And slowly, using the enormous gravity of his fortune, he drew Evelyn and her family into his orbit. There was a second obsession running alongside the first, and the two were tangled together. Harry Thaw hated Stanford White. The hatred had begun before Evelyn, rooted in old snubs, in White's dominance of the very society Thaw wanted to command, in exclusions from clubs and parties that Thaw blamed on the architect. Thaw had come to see White as his personal enemy, a symbol of everything that looked down on him. And when Thaw learned that White had been there first with Evelyn, that the man he already hated had taken the girl he now wanted, the two obsessions fused into one burning fixation. He interrogated Evelyn for hours about what White had done. He made her tell it again and again. Her ruin became, for Thaw, both a torment and a weapon he could aim at his enemy. He took her to Europe. He proposed, repeatedly. Evelyn, who understood Thaw's instability and had already tasted his cruelty, hesitated for a long time. There were episodes abroad, in a rented castle in the Austrian countryside, that she would later describe as terrifying beatings and confinement that revealed exactly what kind of man was courting her. She knew what he was, but she also knew what she was: a used-up scandal in the making, a chorus girl past her first bloom with no fortune, and a family to keep. Thaw offered the one thing her beauty had never been able to buy outright. He offered permanent money. He offered to make a poor girl a Thaw. In April of 1905, she married him. She became Evelyn Nesbit Thaw, mistress of a share of one of America's great fortunes, installed in the Thaw world of Pittsburgh and Newport and New York. On paper, it was the rescue her mother had dreamed of. The poor girl lifted into old money at last. In reality, she had bound herself to a violent and disintegrating man whose two great obsessions, his desire for her and his hatred of Stanford White, were still burning side by side, feeding each other, growing. Think of the machinery now assembled. On one side, Stanford White, the powerful architect with his secret rooms and his ruined girls, moving through the same small world of New York society, still attending the same theatres, still dining at the same restaurants. On the other side, Harry Thaw, armed with $40 million of family money, a mind unhinged, a wife whose violation he had made into his personal crusade, and an old, festering hatred that money and marriage had only inflamed. And between them, married to one and marked by the other, stood Evelyn Nesbit, 20 years old, who had learned by now that being wanted by powerful men was the most dangerous thing that could happen to a woman. She had told Harry Thaw the story of the red velvet swing. She had given her jealous, unstable husband the one weapon he needed, the belief that his enemy had defiled his wife. She had done it under pressure, worn down by his questioning, perhaps hoping to explain herself, perhaps simply exhausted. But the effect was to load a gun. Thaw now carried the story of Stanford White and the swing everywhere he went, nursing it, turning it over, letting it grow into a private mission. He began to carry a pistol as well. The stories that trailed Harry Thaw through the pleasure districts of 2 continents were not the ordinary excesses of a rich young man. They were darker, and they were expensive to bury. There were reports, quietly settled with Thaw money, of his cruelty toward young women, of rooms taken under false names, of a whip, of girls paid well to keep silent afterward. He used cocaine and morphine. His moods swung from lavish charm to sudden violent rage and back again. The family that adored him also spent freely to keep his conduct out of the courts and out of the newspapers. His fortune was, in a real sense, a machine for erasing the consequences of his own nature, and it had been running for years before Evelyn ever met him. She had seen that nature up close before she agreed to marry it. On a journey through Europe, Thaw took her to a remote castle in the Austrian countryside, and there, by her later account, the charm fell away entirely. She described being held against her will, beaten and terrorized over a period of weeks, alone with a man whose obsession with her had turned into something that frightened her badly. She knew, then, precisely what Harry Thaw was. And still, worn down and running out of choices, her first bloom fading and her earning years narrowing, she took the security he offered. That was the arithmetic these women lived by. A dangerous rich man was still a rich man, and a hard safety was still safer than no safety at all. It was only a matter of time and place. The place would be a rooftop in the summer of 1906, in a building that Stanford White himself had designed, on a warm evening when all 3 of them would be in the same crowd. The gun was loaded. The hatred was ready. And the whole thing was about to go off in front of hundreds of people and turn Evelyn Nesbit into the most watched woman in the history of the country. Chapter 4. 3 shots above Madison Square. On a warm June night in 1906, Harry Thaw crossed a crowded rooftop theatre and fired 3 times into Stanford White's face. It happened in front of hundreds of people, under the summer stars, in the very building the dead man had designed. The date was the 25th of June, 1906. The place was the rooftop theatre of Madison Square Garden, Stanford White's own creation, where a light musical called Mam'selle Champagne was playing to a fashionable summer crowd. White was there, seated at a table near the stage, a middle-aged giant of the city out for an evening's amusement. Harry and Evelyn Thaw were there too, dining and moving through the same rooftop. For a while, the 2 men occupied the same warm night air without incident. The architect who had taken Evelyn and the husband, who could not stop thinking about it. As the show neared its end, during a number whose title the newspapers would repeat for years, a song called "I Could Love a Million Girls," Harry Thaw rose from his place. He walked through the tables towards Stanford White. He drew a pistol, and at close range, in front of the whole rooftop, he fired 3 times into White's face. The architect fell backward, his table overturning, and died where he sat. For a moment, the crowd thought it was part of the show. Then the screaming started. Thaw did not run. He held the pistol above his head, some said to show he would do no more harm, and walked toward the elevators. By some accounts, he told his wife that he had done it because White had ruined her. He was arrested without a struggle. And within hours, the news was racing across the country by telegraph. The most famous architect in America had been shot dead in public by the millionaire husband of the most photographed girl in America. There had never been a scandal quite like it. What followed was the first true media spectacle of the modern age, the case the newspapers themselves christened the trial of the century. Every element was irresistible. Great wealth, sexual scandal, a beautiful young woman, a dead celebrity, a killer who could buy the finest defense in the land. The papers printed every rumor and every detail, and circulation soared. The country divided into camps and argued about it at every dinner table. And at the center of the storm, summoned to save the husband who had murdered for her, stood Evelyn Nesbit Thaw. The defense that the Thaw money bought rested entirely on her. Harry's lawyers built their case on the idea that Thaw had been driven temporarily insane by the knowledge of what White had done to his wife, a condition they dressed up for the jury with the phrase a brainstorm, a sudden, ungovernable fit of madness. And to prove that madness had a cause, they needed Evelyn to take the stand and tell the country, in detail, the story of the red velvet swing. Only she could tell it. The entire strategy, the whole effort to keep Harry Thaw out of the electric chair, depended on the testimony of the woman he had married. So consider the strange arithmetic of power in that courtroom. Harry Thaw had the money. His mother, Mary Copley Thaw, poured it into the defense without limit. She declared that she was prepared to pay $1 million to save her son's life. She hired the celebrated California trial lawyer Delphine Delmas. Later, the family brought in another famous attorney, Martin Littleton, for a fee of $25,000. They spent something on the order of $500,000 on doctors and expert witnesses to testify to Harry's madness. Around $1 million of Thaw money was mobilized to save one Thaw life, and all of it, every dollar of it, depended on whether a former chorus girl would open her mouth and give them the story they needed. She gave it. For days, Evelyn Nesbit testified, describing White, the champagne, the mirrored room, the swing, the loss of consciousness, the assault. 10,000 people jammed the streets outside the courthouse to catch sight of her. Her words filled the front pages from coast to coast. A poor girl from Tarentum, Pennsylvania, held the attention of the entire nation because the fate of a fortune's heir hung on which version of events she chose to give. For those weeks, she was, in the most literal sense, the most powerful storyteller in America. The richest woman in the room, Mary Thaw, needed her. The killer in the dock needed her. And she delivered. The first trial, in 1907, ended with a hung jury, the 12 men unable to agree. A second trial was held in 1908. This time, the jury found Harry Thaw not guilty by reason of insanity. He was not freed. He was committed to the Matteawan State Hospital for the criminally insane up the Hudson River, to be held at the state's pleasure. The Thaw money had saved him from the chair. It had not bought him his liberty, not yet. And Evelyn. Having given the performance that saved him, having traded the most private and painful history of her life to keep the Thaw name out of the execution chamber, she discovered what her testimony had actually purchased for her. Nothing. With Harry safely committed, the Thaw family had no more use for the chorus girl who had married their son. They turned on her. They cut her off. The great fortune that had seemed to promise her security closed like a door. By some accounts, she received, in the end, around $25,000 from the family that had needed her so badly, and then was cast out. In a final gesture of contempt for the people who had used and discarded her, she is said to have handed that money to the radical Emma Goldman, letting the Thaw money pass straight into the hands of an anarchist the Thaws would have despised. The defense gave the country a new phrase for what it claimed had seized Harry Thaw. His lawyer, Delphine Delmas, argued that Thaw had been gripped by a peculiarly American madness, the insanity of a husband avenging the ruin of his wife, and he called it dementia Americana. It was invented for the occasion, a theory of temporary madness dressed in patriotic clothing, and it was aimed squarely at the 12 men in the jury box, every one of whom could be made to imagine a wife of his own dishonoured by a man like White. The newspapers seized the phrase and repeated it for months. The whole country argued over whether a husband had the right to kill the man who had defiled his wife. And beneath the grand debate sat the plain fact that only Evelyn's words on the stand could give the theory any foundation at all. The scale of the spectacle staggered even the newspapermen who profited from it. Papers ran special editions that sold out within hours of hitting the streets. Circulation climbed into the hundreds of thousands on the strength of the case alone. The transcript of Evelyn's testimony was reprinted almost word for word across the country, so that families in distant towns read the intimate details of a young woman's ruin over their breakfast tables. It was the largest audience any American woman had ever commanded, and she had commanded it not by any choice of her own, but by catastrophe. She had held real power. For a few weeks, she had held a man's life and a family's name in her mouth, but it was borrowed power, drawn from her beauty and her ruin, and it was never hers to keep. When the verdict came, the borrowing was called in. The most watched woman in America walked out of the courtroom with almost nothing, into a long decline of failing films and vaudeville stages and the slow grip of addiction. The men had fought over her, and one had died, and one had been locked away, and it was the woman at the center who was left to carry the wreckage. Money could buy a marriage. It could not buy silence. And it could not, in the end, protect the girl whose secret had set the whole thing burning. Her story was the loudest, but it was not the first. To find where this pattern began, you have to go back another 30 years to a robber baron, a boarding house girl, and a bundle of letters worth more than any fortune he could give her. Chapter 5. The Boarding House Girl and the Baron. She came out of a boarding house with nothing but her looks, and within a year she had one of the richest men in America paying her bills. Her name was Helen Josephine Mansfield, though the newspapers of the 1870s would make her famous as Josie, and she is the woman who first showed America what a kept mistress could do to a titan of finance. She was born around 1847, and her early life was the usual story of a pretty girl with no money in a country that offered such girls very few honest roads to comfort. She drifted into acting, which in that era sat only a step above the boarding houses and the demi-monde in the eyes of respectable people. She was striking rather than delicate, dark-haired, full-figured, with a warm and knowing face. And in the autumn of 1867, in the tangled world of Manhattan's theatres and pleasure houses, she met the most flamboyant rich man in New York. James Fisk was a spectacle in human form. Everyone called him Jubilee Jim. He had risen from a peddler's wagon in Vermont to the very top of Wall Street, and he had done it with a showman's nerve and a con man's flexible conscience. By the time he met Josie Mansfield, Fisk was a partner of the financier Jay Gould in the notorious struggle for control of the Erie Railroad, one of the dirtiest corporate wars of the century. He had made and lost fortunes. He wore diamonds. He bought a great marble opera house on 23rd Street and ran his railroad offices out of it, surrounded by gilt and velvet and chorus girls. He gave himself the title of admiral of a steamboat line and colonel of a militia regiment, and paraded in uniforms of his own design. He was married, though his wife lived quietly away in Boston, and Fisk pursued his pleasures in New York with the appetite of a man who believed money could buy anything. He wanted Josie Mansfield, and he set out to buy her too. And here the machinery of the kept woman begins to turn. Fisk did not simply take a mistress. He built her a life designed to display his own wealth. He gave her an expensive wardrobe. He gave her jewels. He set her up in a fine townhouse on West 23rd Street, close to his opera house, so that she was always near. And he gave her money, regular checks that ran, by the accounts of the time, into the tens of thousands of dollars. In an age when a comfortable middle-class family lived well on a couple of $1,000s a year, Fisk was pouring a small fortune into the hands of his mistress. Look at the scale of what Fisk commanded and what he spent. He and Gould had fought for a railroad worth tens of millions of dollars. During the Erie War, they had printed new stock almost at will, flooding the market with hundreds of thousands of fresh shares to keep control. Fisk's opera house on 23rd Street had cost a fortune to buy and furnish in marble and gold. Against all that, the checks to Josie Mansfield, running to the tens of thousands, were pocket change to him. But to a boarding house girl who had owned nothing, they were the whole world. She had gone in a single year from a rented room to a townhouse kept by one of the richest and most talked about men in the country. Now, the easy story, the one the men of the time told, was that Josie Mansfield was simply a kept plaything, a decorative possession of Jim Fisk's, no more an agent in her own life than the diamonds around her neck. But that story misses what she was learning. Living at the center of Fisk's world, Josie Mansfield was learning his business. She heard things. She saw the men who came and went from the townhouse and the opera house. Fisk, expansive and careless and in love, confided in her. He talked about his dealings, his enemies, his maneuvers, the parts of his empire that would not survive daylight. And he wrote to her. Letters. Warm, indiscreet, revealing letters that put on paper things a man in his position should never have committed to ink. A kept woman in 1869 had, under the law, almost nothing. She could not vote. If she had married, her property would have passed to her husband under the doctrine of coverture that still governed American women's lives. Josie Mansfield owned her townhouse only so long as Fisk chose to pay for it. Her jewels could be taken back. Her income was a gift that could be stopped with a word. Everything the world could see that she possessed, she held only at the pleasure of a man. But there was one thing she held that the man could not simply take back. She held his secrets. She held his letters. And a woman clever enough to understand what those letters were worth held a kind of power that no amount of Fisk's money could match. Put numbers to the world she now lived in. The Erie Railroad that Fisk and Gould controlled was worth tens of millions of dollars and ran hundreds of miles of track across the state of New York. During their war for it, they flooded the market with 100,000 fresh shares of stock and more, printed almost at will. Fisk's marble opera house had cost a fortune to buy and furnish. The checks he wrote to Josie Mansfield ran into the tens of thousands of dollars a year, at a time when a comfortable family lived on $2,000. She had risen, in a single turn of fortune, from a rented room to the center of one of the largest concentrations of money in America. For a while, none of this mattered, because Fisk was happy and generous, and the checks kept coming. Josie Mansfield reigned in her townhouse as the acknowledged favorite of Jubilee Jim, the mistress of a man the whole city watched. It was as high as a woman of her origins could climb, But the arrangement had a fatal flaw built into its foundation, the same flaw that ran through every story in this film. It depended on the man's desire holding steady. And desire, in the houses of the rich, was the one thing money could not fix in place. To understand what Josie Mansfield had climbed into, you have to grasp the sheer scale of Jim Fisk. He and his partner Jay Gould had seized control of the Erie Railroad in a corporate war against Cornelius Vanderbilt, the richest man in America. And they had won it by printing tens of thousands of fresh shares of stock to drown Vanderbilt's buying. When the courts came after them, they were said to have carried satchels of cash across the river to New Jersey and bought the judges and legislators they needed. In September of 1869, Fisk and Gould tried to corner the entire gold supply of the United States, driving the price into a frenzy until the government dumped its own gold and the market collapsed on the day history would call Black Friday. Fortunes were wiped out in an afternoon. Fisk slipped away from the wreckage with his own money mostly intact and his name in ruins. He spent as loudly as he schemed. He bought a great marble opera house at the corner of 23rd Street and 8th Avenue and ran the Erie Railroad's offices from its upper floors, surrounded by gilt, velvet, and a private supply of chorus girls. He controlled a steamboat line and paraded about as its admiral in a uniform of his own design. And he installed Josie Mansfield in a fine townhouse on 23rd Street, only a few doors from the opera house, so that his mistress was always within reach. She lived there on his money, wore his jewels, and cashed his checks, a boarding house girl set down in the middle of one of the largest fortunes in America. It was as close to that fortune as a woman of her origins could ever get. And it was all held together by nothing sturdier than the affection of a restless and faithless man. There was a darker layer beneath the glamour, and Mansfield sat close enough to see it. Fisk's empire was shielded by the corrupt political machine of Boss Tweed, whose judges signed whatever orders the Erie Ring required. The money that paid for her townhouse and her jewels flowed out of that same machine of bribed courts and watered stock and cornered markets. She was living inside one of the great criminal enterprises of the age, and its master trusted her, talked in front of her, wrote to her. That trust, given so freely by a careless man at the height of his power, was the most valuable thing she would ever hold. She simply did not know it yet. The flaw revealed itself when Fisk, in his careless generosity, introduced Josie Mansfield to his handsome young business partner. Fisk thought he was showing off. He was, in fact, lighting the fuse on his own murder. Because the younger man was everything the fat, flamboyant, aging Fisk was not. And Josie Mansfield had begun to calculate that her future might be safer in other hands. Chapter 6. The Partner Who Took Everything. Fisk introduced his mistress to his handsome young business partner and never imagined she would take both the man and the leverage. The partner's name was Edward Styles Stokes, and he was the sort of man that Jim Fisk, for all his cunning, never learned to fear until it was too late. Edward Stokes came from a good family, which was more than Fisk could say, and he wore his advantages like a man who expected the world to arrange itself around him. He was young, tall, dark, and handsome, with the polished manners of the class Fisk had bought his way into rather than being born to. In 1869, Fisk went into business with Stokes in a Brooklyn oil refinery, one of the many ventures the restless financier scattered his money across. For a time they were partners and friends, the flamboyant older baron and the smooth younger gentleman, moving through the same rich world. Then Stokes met Josie Mansfield. By some accounts it happened at a party Fisk himself hosted, a celebration for his own mistress, at which he cheerfully presented her to his handsome partner. Fisk, so shrewd about railroads and stock, was blind here. He could not imagine that the woman he had lifted out of a boarding house would look at another man. But Josie Mansfield looked, and Edward Stokes, younger and more attractive and closer to her own age than the aging Fisk, looked back. Somewhere in the turn of 1869 into 1870, the mistress of Jim Fisk began an affair with Jim Fisk's business partner. Fisk had brought the two of them together himself at a party thrown in Mansfield's honour around the turn of the year, presenting his handsome partner to his mistress with the easy confidence of a man who could not imagine losing either one. It was the single worst introduction of his life. Within weeks, the friendship between the two men had a crack running through it, and within months, the crack had opened into a canyon. The refinery accounts became a source of open dispute. The warmth turned to suspicion, and the suspicion turned to lawyers. Fisk had handed his rival both his business quarrel and his mistress in the same season, and he would spend the last of his life regretting it. For Josie Mansfield, this was not merely romance. It was calculation, and there is no need to strip her of that calculation to tell the story fairly. She was a woman with no legal security, no property she truly owned, and no income except what a fickle man chose to give her. Fisk was married, growing more famous and more exposed by the month, and no one could say how long his favour would last. Stokes was younger, unmarried in practice, if not in every technicality, and available. To shift her affections from the older man to the younger was, for a woman in her position, a rational move to secure her future. She was doing what women of her time were forced to do with the only assets they had. She was trading up. But this trade was more dangerous than she knew, because it did not simply end one relationship and begin another. It turned the partnership between the two men into a war, and it dragged Josie Mansfield's greatest asset, Fisk's letters, into the centre of that war. When Fisk discovered that Stokes had taken his mistress, the friendship shattered. The refinery partnership dissolved into bitter disputes over money. Fisk, wounded in his pride and his pocket, moved against Stokes with the same ruthlessness he had used against his enemies on Wall Street. He cut off Josie Mansfield's allowance. He accused Stokes of embezzling from the refinery. The lovers and the baron fell into a tangle of lawsuits that would drag through the courts and the newspapers for months. And now, Josie Mansfield reached for the one weapon she truly owned. She still had Fisk's letters, the indiscreet correspondence in which the great financier had written down things that could ruin him. Together with Stokes, she understood exactly what those letters were worth. Fisk was at the height of his fame and the depth of his unpopularity. He had been blamed, along with Gould, for the Black Friday gold panic of 1869, when the two men's scheme to corner the gold market had collapsed and dragged ordinary businesses down with it. His enemies were legion. Letters in which he confessed to shady dealings would be a gift to every one of them. In the right hands, at the right moment, they could destroy him. So Mansfield and Stokes made their move. They threatened to publish the letters unless Fisk paid. This was blackmail, plainly, and it is worth naming it plainly. But it is also worth seeing what it represented. A boarding house girl and a disgraced partner had found the one pressure point on a man worth a fortune, and they pressed it. Josie Mansfield, who under the law owned almost nothing, had turned a rich man's own words into a lever that could move his whole world. For a few months, she held a genuine advantage over James Fisk, one of the most powerful financiers in America. She did not have his money. She had his secrets, and for a while, that was the stronger hand. Fisk, however, was not a man who paid when he could fight. He had spent his whole life in the knife fights of Wall Street, and he did not fold. He struck back through the courts. He brought charges against Stokes. He fought the threatened publication. He used his lawyers and his money and his considerable nerve to turn the legal machinery against the two lovers. The battle swung back and forth through 1871 and into 1872, a public spectacle of accusation and counter-accusation, with the letters, the money, and the woman all in play. Weigh the forces on each side. Fisk commanded a railroad, an opera house, a steamboat line, and a fortune reckoned in the millions. He had lawyers on retainer and newspapers he could influence. Stokes had his family's respectability and his share of a disputed refinery. Josie Mansfield had a townhouse she no longer securely held and a packet of letters. On paper, it was no contest, and on paper, Fisk won. As the legal battles resolved, the courts came down on his side. The blackmail failed. The publication was blocked. Stokes faced the prospect of ruin and possibly prison on the charges Fisk had pressed. For Josie Mansfield, the collapse of the blackmail was a disaster. She had gambled her security on the letters and on Stokes, and the gamble had gone wrong. But the real danger now was not to her. It was to Fisk, because Edward Stokes was not a Wall Street brawler who could lose a legal fight and shrug it off. He was a proud man who had lost his money, his partnership, and his standing, and who now faced humiliation and prison, all because of Jim Fisk. He was cornered. He was enraged. And in early January of 1872, he learned that the courts had turned decisively against him. The refinery that had joined the two men now became the ground of their war. Fisk and Stokes had gone in together on a Brooklyn oil works, and when the affair with Mansfield poisoned the friendship, the business turned into a battlefield. They accused each other of cheating. They dragged the accounts into court. Fisk, who could outspend and outmaneuver almost anyone alive, moved to squeeze his former partner, and he had Stokes charged with taking money from the refinery, a charge that carried the real threat of prison. What had begun as a partnership of gentlemen curdled, within a year, into a fight for one man's freedom and the other man's pride. For Josie Mansfield, the war placed her in the most dangerous position of her life, and also the most powerful. Fisk cut off the money that had kept her, hoping to bring her back to heel. But Mansfield did not crawl back. She had cast her lot with Stokes, and she held the one thing that could still wound Fisk. She began, with Stokes beside her, to think seriously about what a bundle of a rich man's letters might be worth to the rich man who had written them. She was no longer simply a mistress choosing between two men. She was becoming a player at the same table as one of the sharpest operators on Wall Street, wagering the only chip she had against the whole of his fortune. A cornered man with a pistol and nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing in any of these stories. Josie Mansfield had set the pieces in motion with the oldest move available to a woman of her time, the shift of her favor from one man to another. She could not have known it would end where it was about to end, on a grand hotel staircase, with the most famous financier in New York bleeding to death from 2 bullets. But that is where it was going, and when it happened, the whole country would say her name. Chapter 7. The Letters Worth a Fortune. Fisk had written things to her that could ruin him, and she understood exactly what those letters were worth. To grasp why a bundle of private letters could bring down a man worth millions, you have to understand just how exposed James Fisk had become by the winter of 1871. Fisk was, by then, one of the most hated men in America. The Erie Railroad War had made him rich and infamous in equal measure. The Black Friday gold panic of September 1869, the scheme he and Jay Gould had run to corner the nation's gold supply, had ended in a market crash that ruined honest merchants and left Fisk's name a byword for greed and manipulation. Ordinary people who had lost money blamed him. Reformers denounced him. Cartoonists drew him as a bloated pirate. He was rich enough to laugh most of it off, but he had made himself the kind of enemy that the whole country would cheer to see fall. That is the context in which Josie Mansfield's letters became a weapon rather than mere keepsakes. A man so exposed, so surrounded by enemies, could not afford to have his private confessions read aloud. If Fisk had written to Mansfield about the mechanics of his schemes, about payments and manipulations and the secret machinery of his empire, then those letters in public would be more than embarrassing. They could feed lawsuits. They could feed prosecutions. They could arm every enemy he had made in a decade of financial warfare. Josie Mansfield, sitting in her townhouse with a packet of a rich man's indiscretions, was sitting on something genuinely dangerous. She and Stokes pressed the advantage. They let Fisk understand that the letters could be published, that his own words could be turned loose on a public that already despised him unless he came to terms. It was extortion, and it was also, in its way, the single most audacious move any woman in this film makes with the raw materials of her own life. Josie Mansfield had no fortune, no legal standing, no vote, no property she truly controlled. What she had was a rich man's trust, betrayed and weaponized. She took the intimate correspondence of one of the most powerful financiers in the country and tried to convert it into lasting security for herself. The timing could not have been worse for Fisk. The very machine that protected him was coming apart. In the same period, the great political ring of Boss Tweed, whose bribed judges had signed the Erie Ring's orders, was collapsing under the exposure of the newspapers and the reformers. The public mood had turned savagely against the men who had looted the city and the markets, and Fisk stood high on the list of the hated. To have his private letters read aloud in that climate, letters in which he may have written frankly about the very schemes the reformers were chasing, would have been to hand a loaded weapon to every enemy he had. Josie Mansfield was sitting on exactly that weapon, and Fisk knew it. The fight moved into the courts, and it moved into the newspapers, which was itself part of the weapon. In an age just learning the power of the press, the mere airing of the dispute damaged Fisk. The papers reported on the lawsuits, on the accusations, on the existence of letters that a former mistress claimed would expose him. Every column inch was a small wound. Fisk found himself, the master manipulator, manipulated. His private life dragged into public view by a woman he had once thought he owned. The spectacle of it delighted his enemies and mortified his allies. But Fisk fought, as Fisk always fought, without shame and without mercy. He refused to be bled. He turned his lawyers loose. He brought a charge of embezzlement against Edward Stokes over the disputed oil refinery, aiming to put his rival in prison. He fought the threatened publication of the letters through every legal channel. He counterattacked with libel. He used the full weight of his money and his experience against a woman and a younger man who had far less of both. Slowly, through 1871 and into the first days of 1872, the tide turned his way. Here, the scale of the mismatch tells the story. Fisk could field a small army of lawyers and keep them fighting for months without feeling the cost. He was worth millions. He controlled a railroad, an opera house, and a steamboat line. He could influence newspapers and courts alike. Stokes, for all his family name, was fighting to hold on to a share of a single refinery and to stay out of a cell. Josie Mansfield was fighting to hold on to a townhouse she no longer owned outright and to a future that was slipping away. Against a man with millions and no scruples, their letters and their nerve could only carry them so far. And that distance ran out in early January of 1872. The decisive blow fell in the courts. A grand jury moved against Stokes on the embezzlement matter. The legal machinery that Fisk had set in motion was closing on his rival. threatening him with disgrace and imprisonment. For Edward Stokes, it was the end of the road that he could see. He had lost the business. He faced the loss of his liberty, and the man who had done all this to him, the man who had also once possessed the woman he loved, was riding higher than ever, untouchable behind his money. For Josie Mansfield, the failure of the blackmail meant the failure of her whole gamble. The letters had not bought her security. Fisk had beaten them in court. She was left exposed, her reputation shredded in public, her income long since cut off, her great weapon blunted. If the story were only about her fortunes, this would be the point of her defeat. She had reached for power with the one tool she had, and the richer man had knocked it from her hand. But these stories are never only about the woman's fortunes, because the men in them carry guns. Josie Mansfield's gamble had done something she could not undo. It had taken a proud, entitled young man and stripped him of his money, his standing, and his freedom, and it had left him staring at ruin with a loaded sense of grievance. Whatever Josie Mansfield had intended, she had helped drive Edward Stokes to the edge. The letters had failed as blackmail, but the rage they had helped to build was about to succeed as murder. The battle spilled into every arena at once. Mansfield sued Fisk, claiming that he owed her money. Fisk struck back by having Stokes indicted for embezzlement over the refinery. There were hearings, and at those hearings the threat of the letters hung in the air, the possibility that Fisk's private correspondence would be read into a public record for all his enemies to feast on. For a man in his position, the danger was real. His whole empire rested on a network of bribed judges and bought legislators tied to the Tweed machine, and that machine was itself beginning to crack under investigation. The last thing Jim Fisk could afford, in the winter of 1871, was to have his own words about his own dealings splashed across the front pages. So, for a few remarkable weeks, a former boarding house girl and a disgraced young partner held a genuine advantage over one of the most powerful financiers in the country. They had found the pressure point, and they were pressing it. But Fisk had spent a lifetime in exactly this kind of fight, and he did not frighten. He used his money to hire the best lawyers in the city. He used his influence to shape what the papers printed. He used the courts he knew so well to turn the embezzlement charge into a noose around Stokes's neck. Slowly, the advantage slid from the lover's hands back into his own. The letters that had seemed like a fortune became, as the legal tide turned, a fortune they could not cash, and a proud young man watched his ruin come toward him with the unbearable knowledge that the author of it was untouchable. On the afternoon of the 6th of January, 1872, Edward Stokes learned that the legal decisions had gone finally and disastrously against him. He did not go home to accept it. He went looking for Jim Fisk with a pistol in his coat. And Josie Mansfield, who had started as a boarding house girl and climbed to the very center of a robber baron's world, was about to become, forever, the woman at the root of one of the most sensational murders of the age. Chapter 8. Blood on the Hotel Staircase. On the 6th of January, 1872, Edward Stokes climbed the staircase of the Grand Central Hotel with a pistol. He had learned that morning that the courts had turned against him, that Fisk had won, that ruin and possibly prison lay ahead. And he had decided that if he was going down, the man who had put him there would go first. The Grand Central Hotel stood on Broadway, one of the grandest and newest hotels in the city, a marble monument to the wealth of the age. Jim Fisk arrived there in the afternoon, on some ordinary errand of business or society, dressed as always in the finery of Jubilee Jim. As he came up the grand staircase, Edward Stokes was waiting for him at the top. There were no lawyers here, no courts, no money to deploy. There was only a cornered man and the man who had cornered him, and a pistol. Stokes fired twice. One ball struck Fisk in the arm, the other tore into his abdomen. The most flamboyant financier in America, the man who had cornered gold and looted a railroad and bought an opera house, collapsed on the marble staircase of a luxury hotel, shot by the partner whose life he had helped to wreck over the love of Josie Mansfield. Stokes was seized almost at once. Fisk was carried to a room in the hotel, where doctors could do nothing but ease his passing. He did not die quickly. Jim Fisk lingered through the evening and into the night, in great pain, fully aware of what had happened to him. And in those hours, he did the one thing that would seal Stokes's fate. He named his killer. Clearly and repeatedly, to the men gathered around his bed, the dying Fisk identified Edward Stokes as the man who had shot him. There would be no mystery here, no unsolved crime. The victim himself, with his last strength, pointed at the murderer. On the morning of the 7th of January, 1872, James Fisk died. He was 36 years old. The killing of Jim Fisk marked something new in American life, the murder of a national celebrity that the whole country experienced together, almost in real time, through the telegraph and the daily press. People who had never been within 100 miles of New York knew the names by the next morning: Fisk, Stokes, and Mansfield. The story had everything the age craved: a fallen titan, a beautiful woman, a jealous rival, a public killing on a marble staircase. It was, in every sense but the name, the first trial of the century, 3 decades before the Thaw case would claim that title. And at the center of it, blamed by all and charged by none, stood a woman who had never fired a shot. The city convulsed. Whatever they had thought of Jubilee Jim in life, the manner of his death gripped the public completely. He was given a spectacular funeral, his coffin guarded by the militia regiment he had played at commanding, watched by enormous crowds. And immediately, inevitably, the whole story spilled out into the newspapers, and at the center of it stood a woman, Josie Mansfield, the mistress, the boarding house girl who had risen to a townhouse on a robber baron's money, thrown him over for his handsome partner, tried to blackmail him with his own letters, and, in the eyes of the public, driven 2 men to a killing. The trials of Edward Stokes stretched across the next 2 years and gripped the nation. He was tried not once, but 3 times. The first trial ended without a settled verdict. The second was thrown into confusion and did not stand. Only at the 3rd trial did the state secure a conviction, and even then not for the murder in the 1st degree that might have sent him to the gallows, but for manslaughter. Edward Stokes was sentenced to prison and served 4 years of a 6-year sentence in Sing Sing before walking free. He had killed one of the most famous men in America in cold blood on a hotel staircase, and he served 4 years for it. Money and a good name, even in defeat, still counted for something. And Josie Mansfield. She was never charged with any crime. She had fired no shot. But she was tried nonetheless, in the only court that mattered for a woman of her kind, the court of the newspapers. And there she was convicted absolutely. The press cast her as the scheming temptress at the root of it all, the Cleopatra of the boarding houses, whose greed and faithlessness had cost a great man his life. The letters that had been her weapon became, in the retelling, proof of her villainy. The very audacity that had briefly made her powerful was turned into the evidence of her wickedness. She had reached higher than a woman of her origins was ever supposed to reach, and the fall was arranged to be total. Consider what she was left with when the shooting stopped. The townhouse was gone. The income had ended long before. The letters had failed. The man she had thrown Fisk over for, Edward Stokes, went to prison and, when he emerged, did not build any lasting life with her. Fisk was dead, and Josie Mansfield's name had become a national synonym for the dangerous mistress. She had gone from owning nothing to holding a robber baron's secrets and briefly threatening his empire, back to owning nothing again, only now with infamy attached. What became of her afterward is the quiet coda that so many of these women share. She left New York. She drifted, as a woman with a ruined name and no fortune had to drift. She lived in Boston, in Philadelphia, out in the Dakotas, and at last across the ocean in Paris, further and further from the city that had once printed her name in every paper. She had money troubles to the end. And in 1931, an old woman far from the scene of her fame, Josie Mansfield, died in Paris. Almost 60 years after the shots on the staircase, remembered, if at all, only as the woman Jim Fisk died for. The funeral of Jim Fisk was a spectacle worthy of the life. His body lay in state, and enormous crowds filed past to see the fallen showman of Wall Street. The militia regiment he had loved to command escorted his coffin through streets lined with thousands of onlookers, a brass band playing him out of the city he had scandalized and delighted in equal measure. In death, the hated speculator became, for one strange moment, a folk figure, mourned and gawked at by the same public that had cursed his name after Black Friday. The man had understood, to the very end, that a crowd will always come to a good show, even his own. The trials of Edward Stokes dragged the story out for 2 more years. The first jury could not agree. The second verdict was thrown out on appeal over an error in the proceedings. Only at the third trial did the state finally win, and even then the charge came down from murder to manslaughter, and the sentence to 6 years, of which Stokes served 4 before walking out of Sing Sing a free man. He went on to run a fashionable Manhattan hotel and lived for decades more. He had shot one of the most famous men in America to death on a public staircase, and he lost 4 years of his life for it. The good name and the money that Josie Mansfield never had were, even at his lowest moment, still worth something to Edward Stokes. She was the first. The boarding house girl who showed America that a kept woman, armed with nothing but a rich man's letters and her own nerve, could bring a titan to the edge of ruin and, in the wreckage, to his death. 30 years later, Evelyn Nesbit would live out a louder, brighter version of the same pattern. And in between and after, in cabs and choir lofts and Hollywood bungalows, other women would find themselves standing where Josie Mansfield had stood, at the exact point where a rich man's secret love turned into a rich man's violent death. The next of them rode in a hansom cab down a New York street on a June morning with a bookmaker who was about to die in her lap. But first, 30 miles from where Fisk fell, in the respectable church-going world of New Jersey, a rich man's wife would show the country a different face of the same story. Not the mistress this time, the wife. And she would prove that when the money sat on the wife's side of the triangle, it was the mistress who ended up dead. Chapter 9. The Rich Wife and the Rector. Frances Stevens Hall was the wealthiest person in her own marriage, and in the tragedy that was coming, wealth would be the only thing that saved her. She was not a chorus girl or a kept mistress. She was a pillar of the church, a woman of old money and older respectability, and that is exactly what makes her story so revealing. Because the pattern that killed a robber baron and a famous architect could reach even into the quiet Episcopal parishes of New Jersey. And when it did, the money decided who survived it. She was born Frances Noel Stevens in 1874 into one of the oldest and most comfortable families of New Brunswick, New Jersey. The Stevens and Carpenter families had deep roots in the town and deep connections to its wealth. Her people were tied, through marriage and business, to the rising fortune of Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical company that would make New Brunswick famous. Her ancestors reached back to the founding of the country. This was not new money or theatrical money. This was the settled, church-going wealth of an established American family, the kind that owned its houses outright and sat in the front pews. By 1922, Frances Hall's personal worth was reported in the newspapers at around $1,700,000, a sum equal to nearly $30 million in the money of a century later. She herself would dispute the figure, but the point stands. She was rich, independently and substantially rich, in an era when very few women held that kind of money in their own name. Put her beside the other women in this film, and the contrast is stark. Evelyn Nesbit counted her security in the low tens of thousands and lost even that. Josie Mansfield owned nothing she could keep. Frances Hall was worth a fortune, and she knew it, and so did everyone around her. Her husband was a different kind of figure altogether. Edward Wheeler Hall was an Episcopal clergyman, the rector of the Church of St. John the Evangelist in New Brunswick. He was some 7 years younger than his wife, a mild and well-liked man of the cloth, respected in the town, comfortable in the world of parish teas and vestry meetings and Sunday sermons. In marrying Frances Stevens, he had married up into her family's money and standing. She brought the fortune. He brought the collar and the position. It was, in its quiet way, a marriage of exactly the kind this film keeps circling, a union in which status and money were the visible currency, and in which the question of love went politely unasked. The arithmetic of the Hall marriage tells the whole story of the power inside it. Frances brought a fortune reported at nearly $1,700,000, the equal of tens of millions in the money of a century later. Edward Hall brought a rector's salary, a clergyman's modest wage in a prosperous parish. She owned the house. She owned the security. She owned, in every practical sense, the life they shared. In an age when almost no married woman controlled her own money, Frances Hall controlled a great deal of it, and her husband lived inside her wealth the way a guest lives inside a fine hotel, comfortable, cared for, and never quite the owner of the ground beneath his feet. On the surface, it was a model of respectability. The rector and his older, wealthy wife lived in a fine house on Nickel Avenue. He tended his flock. She supported the church and moved in the comfortable circles her name entitled her to. There were no chorus lines here, no opera houses, no diamonds bought by a robber baron. There was choir practice and charity work, and the slow rhythm of a prosperous parish. If you had drawn up a list of the households in America least likely to end in a double murder splashed across every front page in the country, the Halls of New Brunswick would have been near the top of it. But respectability is a surface, and this film is about what runs underneath surfaces. Beneath the calm of the rectory, the same human fact that drove every other story here was quietly at work. The rector, married for status and comfort to an older woman who held the purse, had found something his marriage did not give him. He had found it close to home. In the last place a wealthy wife would think to look, in the choir of his own church. And the woman he found there was everything Frances Hall was not. She was poor. She was passionate. She was young, and she was writing him letters. Here the coming tragedy already casts its shadow, because the elements are the same as ever, only rearranged. In the Fisk story, the rich man kept a poor mistress, and the letters were his. In this story, the rich one is the wife, and the dangerous letters belong to the poor mistress and the straying husband. The triangle has been turned around, but it is the same triangle. A marriage held together by money and position. A secret love that the money was supposed to prevent. And, waiting in the wings, the violence that secret love kept producing whenever it collided with the pride and property of the rich. What did Frances Hall know? And when did she know it? That question would consume the country 4 years later, and it has never been answered. But consider her position as the wife. She was older than her husband. She had brought the money to the marriage. She had married a younger clergyman and installed him in a life her fortune made possible. And now, if the whispers were true, that husband was carrying on with a married woman from his own choir, a woman far below the Stevens family in every worldly measure. For a woman of Frances Hall's standing, the humiliation of that, should it become public, would be considerable. Her name, her family's name, the dignity of the church she supported, all of it was exposed to scandal by her husband's secret. The Stevens and Carpenter families were not merely comfortable. They were part of the bedrock of New Brunswick, the kind of people whose names appeared on the founding rolls of churches and banks. Frances's forebears reached back to the Revolution. Her family's money was entangled with the great local enterprise, the pharmaceutical firm of Johnson & Johnson, whose rise was making the whole town prosper. This was settled American wealth, the sort that did not perform itself in opera houses or on Broadway stages, but sat quietly in solid houses and front pews and trust accounts. When the newspapers later put Frances Hall's personal worth at around $1,700,000, they were describing a woman who could nearly have bought and sold the town she lived in. Her husband's world was smaller and softer. Edward Wheeler Hall led the congregation at the Church of St. John the Evangelist, a respected rector in a respectable parish, beloved by many of his flock. He was the junior partner in the marriage in every worldly sense, younger than his wife and dependent on her fortune for the comfortable life they shared. Theirs was a union that looked, from the outside, like a model of Christian respectability, the devoted rector and his dignified, well-born wife. It was also, in the plain terms this film keeps returning to, a marriage in which the money and the status ran one way and the affection, it would turn out, ran another. He had married into security. What he had not found in it was passion, and a man who does not find passion in his marriage, in these stories, has a dangerous habit of finding it somewhere far more perilous. And Frances Hall was not a powerless woman. This is the crucial difference between her and almost everyone else in this film. When the crisis came, she would not be a chorus girl with nothing but her word, or a mistress with nothing but a packet of letters. She would be a wealthy woman with a powerful family, able to command the best lawyers money could buy, backed by relatives who would close ranks around her without hesitation. Whatever was about to happen in that New Jersey field, Frances Hall would meet it from a position of strength that not one of the other women here possessed. That strength was about to be tested in the most extreme way imaginable. Because on a September night in 1922, her husband and the choir singer he loved would be shot to death and left lying together under a tree on an abandoned farm, their love letters scattered around their bodies. And the finger of suspicion, almost at once, would swing toward the rich, dignified, betrayed wife on Nickel Avenue. Chapter 10. The choir singer he loved. In the church choir sang a poor married woman who wrote the rector love letters far more passionate than anything his wife received. Her name was Eleanor Mills, and she is the poor mistress of this story, the woman on the wrong side of the money, and her fate is the clearest proof in the whole film of what happened to the woman who lost. Eleanor Mills was married to James Mills, the sexton of the very church Edward Hall led. A sexton was the caretaker of the church, a humble and poorly paid position, and the Mills family lived close to the edge of poverty that such a wage implied. Eleanor was younger than the rector, lively and unhappy in her narrow circumstances, and she sang in the choir he directed. Out of that ordinary parish arrangement, choir practice and Sunday services, and the small shared work of a church, grew a love affair between the rector and the sexton's wife that would end with both of them dead. What made Eleanor Mills dangerous, in the end, was not her poverty, but her passion, and the fact that she put it on paper. She and Edward Hall exchanged love letters, and hers were ardent, romantic, full of a yearning that the dry respectability of the rectory had never satisfied in him. She wrote of their love as something sacred and consuming. She imagined a future with him. These were not the careful notes of two people hiding an affair. They were the outpourings of a woman who believed she had found the great love of her life in a man married to someone else, someone richer, someone older. And like every set of letters in this film, they were a secret that would not stay buried. The gap between the two women in Edward Hall's life could not have been wider, and that gap is the engine of the tragedy. On one side stood Frances Stevens Hall, worth nearly $1,700,000, mistress of a fine house, backed by an old and powerful family, older than her husband, and secure in every worldly way, except, perhaps, in his heart. On the other side stood Eleanor Mills, the wife of a church caretaker, living close to poverty, younger, poorer, and passionately in love with the same man. One woman had the money and the marriage. The other had the letters and, if the letters are to be believed, the love. Between them stood a mild clergyman who had married one and adored the other. This is the same fault line that ran through every story so far, drawn now in the sharpest possible terms. In America, a poor woman's love affair and a rich woman's marriage did not stand on equal ground. The law, the church, and society all protected the marriage and condemned the affair. A wealthy wife who was wronged had every institution on her side. A poor mistress who loved another woman's husband had nothing but her feelings and her letters, and both of those could be used against her. Eleanor Mills was playing, without the money to back it, the most dangerous game a woman of her time could play. She was in love with a rich woman's husband, and she was writing it down. Weigh the two women against each other one more time, because the whole tragedy turns on the gap between them. Frances Hall had a fortune, a family name that anchored the town, and every institution of church and law arrayed on the side of her marriage. Eleanor Mills had a caretaker husband, a small house, a beautiful voice, and a stack of love letters. In the ledger of the age, the wife held everything, and the mistress held nothing but her feelings. But feelings written down become evidence, and evidence in the wrong hands becomes a motive for murder. The poorest person in the triangle had made herself, without ever meaning to, the most dangerous. For a while, the affair ran its secret course through the ordinary machinery of parish life, hidden in plain sight among the hymnals and the choir robes. But secrets in a small town leak. There were those who noticed how the rector and the sexton's wife looked at each other, who saw them together, who suspected. In a place like New Brunswick, where everyone knew everyone and the Stevens name carried weight, such a thing could not stay hidden forever. The pressure was building, quietly, the way it always built in these stories, toward the moment when the private arrangement would crack open into the public air. James Mills, Eleanor's husband, was the sexton of the church, the man who unlocked the doors and tended the building and rang the bell, and he earned the small wage such work commanded. The Mills family lived in genuinely modest circumstances, a world away from the Hall household on Nickel Avenue, though the two families were bound together by the same church. Eleanor was younger than the rector, restless in her poverty and her marriage, and gifted with a romantic imagination that her narrow life gave her nowhere to spend. In the choir, under the direction of a gentle and cultivated clergyman, she found an outlet at last. And then she found something far more than an outlet. The letters that passed between them were the heart of the danger, because Eleanor Mills did not love in half measures, and she did not hide her love on the page. She wrote to Edward Hall of a bond she believed was sacred, of a love greater than the ordinary loves of ordinary people, of a future she imagined the two of them might somehow share. She poured onto paper exactly the feeling that a poor married woman in love with a rich woman's husband could least afford to put into writing. Every ardent line was a hostage handed to fortune. In a small town where the Stevens name meant everything and gossip travelled fast, a bundle of such letters was a scandal waiting for a match, and someone in time would strike one. And then, in September of 1922, it cracked. On the night of the 14th of September, Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills left their homes and did not come back. 2 days later, on the 16th of September, their bodies were found together on an abandoned farm on the edge of town, in a spot known to locals as a lover's lane beneath a crabapple tree. They had been arranged, laid out side by side. The rector had been shot once in the head. Eleanor Mills had been shot 3 times, and her throat had been cut, and scattered around and between the two bodies, torn and strewn like a final act of contempt, were their love letters. The staging of the scene is the part that has haunted the case for 100 years, because it was not the chaos of a robbery or a random killing. It was deliberate. The bodies placed together, the letters spread out for whoever found them to read. Someone had wanted the love affair displayed alongside the corpses, wanted the secret exposed at the very moment it was punished. Whoever killed Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills had not only ended their lives, they had put the affair on show. They had turned the killing into a message about a rich man's wife, a poor man's wife, and a love that was never supposed to exist. The scale of what followed tells you how completely the case seized the country. The murders happened in a town of some 40,000 people, but the story would fill front pages nationwide for years. 2 separate New Jersey counties would fight over jurisdiction, fumbling the crucial early investigation. 4 years later, the case would produce a trial with more than 150 witnesses, hundreds of reporters, and a courthouse mobbed by crowds. Telegraph companies would string extra wires to carry the coverage. Millions of words would be written about 2 bodies under a tree. And at the center of all of it, from the very first day, stood the wealthy widow whose husband lay dead beside his mistress. Because suspicion moved toward Frances Hall almost immediately, and it never entirely left her. She had the oldest motive in the world, a straying husband and a public humiliation. She had the means, through her family, to arrange whatever she wished. And she had, in her wealth and her powerful relatives, exactly the resources needed to survive an accusation of murder. The poor mistress lay dead in the field, with her throat cut and her love letters in the dirt. The rich wife stood in her fine house on Nickel Avenue, dignified and composed, and prepared to meet whatever came. The contrast between the 2 women had been brutal in life. In death, it was about to become the whole story. Chapter 11. 2 bodies under the crab apple tree. They were found lying side by side beneath a crab apple tree, both shot, their love letters scattered between them like a final insult. It was the 16th of September, 1922, and a young couple out walking on an abandoned farm on the edge of New Brunswick came upon a scene that would obsess America for the rest of the century. The 2 bodies lay together in the shade of the tree, arranged with a care that made the horror worse. Edward Wheeler Hall, the rector, lay on his back, a bullet in his head. Eleanor Mills, the choir singer he had loved, lay beside him, shot 3 times, her throat cut so deeply that the wound nearly severed her head. Her hand had been placed on his knee, or his arm arranged near her, as though the killer had wanted them posed as lovers even in death. And around and between them, torn into pieces and scattered across the ground, were the love letters they had written to each other. The rector's calling card was propped, by some accounts, against the sole of his shoe. The whole scene had been composed like a tableau, a message left for the world to read. From the first hour, the investigation was a disaster, and the reasons why are part of what let a killer go free. The abandoned farm sat near the line between 2 counties, Middlesex and Somerset, and the 2 jurisdictions could not agree on whose case it was. In the confusion, the crime scene was left unguarded and was trampled by sightseers. Souvenir hunters stripped bark from the crabapple tree and carried away anything they could find. Evidence was lost, contaminated, or never properly gathered. By the time the authorities sorted out who was in charge, the physical trail had been ruined. It was one of the worst handled murder scenes in the history of American crime, and it happened around 2 of the most sensational corpses of the age. The mishandling went far beyond the ruined ground. The 2 counties passed the case back and forth, each reluctant to shoulder the cost and the scrutiny of so sensational a crime. Witnesses were interviewed carelessly or not at all. The physical evidence that had survived the souvenir hunters was gathered without the rigor such a killing demanded. And all the while the newspapers fed on it, printing theories, naming suspects, turning 2 dead bodies in a New Jersey field into a national entertainment. The appetite was enormous, and it never truly faded. Even as the official investigation stalled and died, the public hunger for the story stayed alive, waiting for someone with a motive of their own to feed it again. Suspicion, from the beginning, pointed at the wronged wife and her family. The motive was obvious. Edward Hall had been carrying on with Eleanor Mills, and the affair, once exposed, would have humiliated Frances Hall and stained the proud Stevens name. Attention fastened on Frances and on her 2 brothers, Henry Stevens and William Stevens, known as Willie, and on a cousin, Henry Carpenter. Had the family learned of the affair? Had they followed the lovers to their meeting place? Had they decided to end the scandal with bullets and arrange the bodies to make a point? The questions hung over the Stevens family from the start. But the Stevens family had what the dead choir singer had never possessed, and what almost none of the women in this film possessed. They had money, and they had the will to use it. Where the early investigation floundered, the family's resources and standing quietly worked in their favor. Frances Hall met the storm with composure that struck observers as either dignified grief or chilling calm, depending on what they already believed about her. She was questioned. Her family was questioned. And in 1922, despite the obvious motive and the swirl of suspicion, no one was charged. A grand jury heard the matter and declined to indict. The botched investigation had left the state without a case it could win, and the wealthy widow of New Brunswick returned to her fine house, legally untouched. In that vacuum, rumor did the work the law would not. The town whispered. The papers speculated. Everyone had a theory, and no one had a case that could be proved. The silence of the authorities was taken by many as proof that the Stevens money had quietly closed the matter, a suspicion that would only harden into certainty in the years to come. For 4 years, the case went cold. Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills lay in their graves, their murder unsolved, their story fading from the front pages. Frances Hall lived on in her wealth and her respectability, and it seemed for a time that the death of the rector and the choir singer would join the long list of American killings that money and confusion had quietly buried. The place where they were found had a name the newspapers would make famous: De Russey's Lane, a country track past an abandoned farm on the outskirts of town, known to local couples as a place to be alone. It made a grim kind of sense that the rector and the choir singer had gone there. It made a grimmer kind of sense that someone had followed them. The bodies lay beneath the crabapple tree for 2 days before anyone found them, and by then the ground held a story that no one would ever fully read, because almost at once the reading became impossible. What happened to that crime scene in the days after is one of the great failures in the history of American policing. Word spread, and the curious came in their hundreds. They walked the very ground where the bodies had lain. They picked up whatever caught their eye. Souvenir hunters stripped the bark clean off the crabapple tree and carried it away piece by piece, until the tree itself, the silent witness to the killing, had been dismantled by trophy takers. Whatever footprints or dropped objects or spent shells the killer had left behind were trampled into meaninglessness. And while the crowds destroyed the evidence, the 2 counties that shared the ground argued over which of them was responsible, losing the crucial first days to a squabble over jurisdiction. Then the newspapers reached back into the grave and pulled the case out again. In 1926, the New York Daily Mirror, a hungry tabloid in the fierce circulation wars of the Jazz Age, decided that the Hall Mills murders were too good a story to leave dead. The paper began to publish fresh claims, new supposed evidence, allegations that the case had been covered up to protect the wealthy Stevens family. The campaign was relentless and calculated to sell papers, and it worked. Public pressure built until the governor of New Jersey, A. Harry Moore, ordered the case reopened. What the botched investigation of 1922 had let slip, the tabloid press of 1926 dragged back into the light. This is the moment that reveals the real machinery of these stories, the machinery this whole film is about. A murder that the legal system had let die was revived not by new detective work, but by a newspaper chasing circulation. The press had become powerful enough to force the hand of a state government to compel a prosecution that the authorities had been content to leave buried. And the woman at the center of it, Frances Hall, now found herself dragged back into a fight she must have believed she had already won. This time, there would be no quiet dismissal. This time, there would be a trial, and the whole country would watch. Consider the scale of the spectacle that the reopened case became. When Frances Hall and her brothers were finally brought to trial in the autumn of 1926, the little courthouse in Somerville, New Jersey, became the center of the nation's attention. More than 150 witnesses would be called. Some 200 reporters packed the courtroom. Special telegraph and telephone lines were installed to carry the coverage across the country. Crowds gathered outside each day. Vendors sold souvenirs. A murder in a New Jersey field had become the greatest show in America, and the star of it was the wealthy widow in her black mourning clothes, sitting composed and unreadable at the defense table. Frances Hall was on trial for her life, accused of murdering her husband and his mistress. But she was not a chorus girl with only her word, or a mistress with only her letters. She was a woman of great wealth, backed by a powerful family and defended by the finest lawyers her fortune could buy. The poor woman in this triangle was already dead, her throat cut, her letters scattered in the dirt. Now the rich woman would face the ultimate test of whether money could carry her through even an accusation of double murder. The answer she was about to receive would say everything about how power actually worked in America. Chapter 12. The Widow Who Walked Free. 4 years later, A tabloid dragged the case back into court, and the richest woman in the room walked out acquitted. The trial of Frances Stevens Hall and her brothers, held in the Somerset County Courthouse in Somerville through November of 1926, was one of the most heavily covered trials the country had ever seen, and it ended almost exactly as the wealth of the defendant made likely. The prosecution's case rested heavily on a single extraordinary witness, a woman named Jane Gibson, whom the newspapers gleefully nicknamed the Pig Woman because she raised hogs on a nearby farm. Gibson claimed that on the night of the murders, she had been out on her land, riding her mule after a suspected thief, and that she had seen and heard the killing take place. She claimed to have witnessed figures in the darkness near the crabapple tree, to have heard a woman's voice, to have heard shots. If the jury believed her, she placed the killers at the scene. She was the prosecution's best hope of tying the Stevens family to the murders. But Jane Gibson was dying as the trial approached, gravely ill, and the manner of her testimony became one of the most macabre scenes in the history of American courtrooms. She was brought into the courtroom on a bed, carried in on a stretcher, and gave her evidence lying down, pale and failing, while the whole country read about it. It was pure theatre, and the tabloids loved it. But theatre is not the same as proof. The defence, armed with the resources of the Hall fortune, went to work on her credibility. Her story had shifted over the years. Her health made her a fragile witness. Her own mother, present in the courtroom, was said to have muttered against her. Under the pressure of a well-funded defence, the Pig Woman's dramatic testimony began to look less like eyewitness truth and more like an unreliable performance. This is where the money told, quietly and decisively. Frances Hall's defence could afford to challenge every witness, to probe every inconsistency, to hire the expertise and put in the hours that a poor defendant never could. The prosecution, by contrast, was working with a case that had been ruined at the scene 4 years earlier, its physical evidence lost, its trail cold, forced to lean on a dying hog farmer and on handwriting and circumstance. Against a wealthy family with the best lawyers in the state, it was not enough. The advantage that money bought in that courtroom was not dramatic or visible. It was the slow, grinding superiority of a defence that could out-resource the state at every turn. Ask what the acquittal actually proved, and the answer is uncomfortable. It did not prove that Frances Hall was innocent. It proved that the state could not overcome a wealthy family's defence with a ruined crime scene and a dying witness. Those are not the same thing. 100 years of writers and investigators have picked over this case, and it has never been solved, never been closed, never delivered the resolution the country demanded. What it delivered instead was a lesson about power, taught in a small New Jersey courtroom to an audience of millions. When money stood accused in America, money usually walked. The poor woman in the field stayed dead. The rich woman went home. On the 3rd of December, 1926, after a trial that had gripped the nation for a month, the jury returned. It had not taken them long. Frances Stevens Hall was acquitted. Her brothers were acquitted. The wealthy family walked out of the Somerville courthouse cleared of all charges, free to return to their lives and their fortune. The poor choir singer remained in her grave with her throat cut. The mild rector remained in his. And the murder of Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills passed into history as one of the most famous unsolved killings America has ever produced. No one was ever convicted. No one was ever punished. The case is open to this day. Weigh the outcome against everything that led to it. 2 people were shot to death and arranged beneath a tree with their love letters torn around them. The obvious motive pointed straight at the wronged wife and her proud, wealthy family. A newspaper had to force the state to prosecute at all. And when the state finally did, the richest people in the story were acquitted in a matter of hours. Whether Frances Hall was innocent or guilty, no one living can now say for certain. But what the case shows beyond any doubt is the difference that wealth and standing made when a member of the moneyed class stood accused. The poor mistress died. The rich wife walked free. That was not an accident of the evidence. It was the shape of American justice when money sat on one side of the scale. The jury had deliberated only a few hours before clearing every defendant, a speed that told its own story about how thin the state's case had become by the end. Whatever the truth of that night in the lane, the law was now finished with it. No one would ever stand trial for the murders again, and the file would stay open and empty for the next 100 years. And what of Frances Hall herself, the woman at the centre? She never confessed, never wavered, never gave the country the resolution it craved. She returned to her house on Nickel Avenue and lived out her remaining years in the same wealthy respectability she had always known, dignified and silent, protected by the acquittal and by the fortune that had helped secure it. She died in 1942, 20 years after her husband and his mistress were found under the crabapple tree, taking whatever she knew to her own grave. The Stevens name survived. The scandal, in time, faded. The money had done its work. But observe the strange cost that even Frances Hall could not escape. The cost that touches every woman in this film in some form. She kept her freedom and her fortune. What she could not keep was her name's innocence. For the rest of her life, and for 100 years after, half the country would believe that Frances Hall had gotten away with murder, that the composed widow in her black mourning clothes had ordered or committed the killing of her husband and the woman he loved, and had bought her way clear. She was acquitted in a court of law. She was never acquitted in the mind of the public. The verdict cleared her. The suspicion never lifted. She had used her wealth to win the only kind of victory available to her, and it left her a free woman under a permanent shadow. The trial produced its own gallery of unforgettable figures beyond the pig woman on her stretcher. Frances Hall's brother, William Stevens, known as Willie, was widely regarded as eccentric and simple-minded, and the prosecution expected to break him easily on the stand. Instead, Willie Stevens answered every question with a calm, plain shrewdness that won the courtroom over and never once stumbled into the contradiction the state was hunting for. The prosecution's other great hope, a claim that a fingerprint on the rector's fallen calling card belonged to Willie, dissolved under the defense's attack on how the evidence had been gathered and handled. Piece by piece, the case the tabloids had built up was taken apart by lawyers the Hall fortune had paid for. When it was over, Frances Hall did something that revealed just how completely wealth had shifted the ground beneath the whole affair. She turned on the newspaper that had forced her to trial. She brought suit against the New York Daily Mirror, the tabloid whose circulation campaign had reopened the investigation, seeking damages for what it had put her through. It was the final assertion of a rich woman's power. She had been dragged into court by the press, and now she used the courts to strike back at the press. Then she returned to her house on Nickel Avenue and lived out 16 more years in wealth and silence, dying in 1942 with the secret, whatever it was, still locked inside her. 3 women now, across 50 years, standing at the exact point where a status marriage met a secret love, and the whole thing detonated. A chorus girl who testified to save the husband who killed for her. A boarding house mistress who armed the man who murdered her baron. A wealthy wife who walked free from the deaths of her husband and his lover. Different starting points, different weapons, different endings, and underneath them all the same brutal machinery. But the pattern was not finished. 2 more women were caught in it, one in a hansom cab on a summer morning, one in the bright new world of Hollywood, and their stories complete the picture of what it meant to be a woman at the center of a rich man's death. Chapter 13. The Girl in the Hansom Cab. The cab rolled down West Broadway. A shot cracked from inside it, and the married gambler died in the showgirl's lap. It was the morning of the 4th of June, 1904, 2 years before Harry Thaw ever climbed to that rooftop, and the woman beside the dying man was a Broadway beauty named Nan Patterson. Nan Patterson was, like Evelyn Nesbit, one of the manufactured goddesses of the American stage. She was a member of the company associated with Florodora, the wildly popular musical whose sextet of matched beauties had become the era's definition of desirability. To be a Florodora girl was to be famous simply for being lovely, to be pursued by the rich men who filled the front rows. Patterson was young, striking, and like so many chorus girls of her time, entangled with a wealthy married man who kept her and would not marry her. The man was Francis Thomas Young, known to the racing world and the sporting crowd as Caesar Young. He was a well-known bookmaker and gambler, a man who lived on other people's wages and his own luck, and he was married. His relationship with Nan Patterson was the familiar arrangement, the rich sporting man and the beautiful showgirl, conducted openly enough that everyone in their world knew about it, promising enough to keep her hoping, but always shadowed by the wife he would not leave. By the spring of 1904, Young had apparently decided to end the affair. He and his wife booked passage to Europe, a voyage designed in part to break him free of Nan Patterson for good. On the morning he was to sail, Patterson met him, and the two of them took a hansom cab together down through Lower Manhattan, toward the piers where the ship waited. What passed between them in that closed cab, no living person can fully know. What is known is that as the cab moved down West Broadway and neared Franklin Street, at around 8:30 in the morning, a muffled shot rang out from inside it. When the cab stopped, Caesar Young was slumped against Nan Patterson, shot through the chest, dying. Within minutes, the gambler was dead, and the Florodora girl was covered in his blood, at the center of a killing that would fill the New York papers for a year. Patterson's account was that Young had shot himself, that in a moment of despair over their parting, he had turned a pistol on his own body. The state did not believe her. The prosecution built a case that Nan Patterson had shot her lover rather than lose him to his wife and the ship to Europe, and the physical evidence gave them a thread to pull. The pistol was traced to a pawn shop, where it had reportedly been bought the day before the killing by a couple whose description matched Nan Patterson's sister, Julia, and her husband, Morgan Smith. If that was true, then the gun that killed Caesar Young had been procured by Patterson's own family the day before he died, which pointed not to sudden suicide, but to premeditation. The prosecutor who took up the case was a familiar figure in these stories, the same crusading Manhattan district attorney, William Travers Jerome, who would later prosecute Harry Thaw. Jerome was determined, capable, and convinced of Patterson's guilt. On paper, the power in the courtroom was all on his side. He had the machinery of the state, the pawnshop evidence, the obvious motive of a woman about to be abandoned. Against him stood a chorus girl accused of murder, facing the possibility of the electric chair. And here, Nan Patterson revealed the one form of power available to a woman in her position, and she wielded it with the instincts of a born performer. She could not command wealth like Frances Hall or leverage like Josie Mansfield. What she could command was sympathy. Young, beautiful, tearful, and cast as the wronged girl abandoned by a faithless married man, Nan Patterson became a public darling. The newspapers, hungry as ever, made her a heroine. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse to cheer her. The public did not want to see this lovely girl sent to the chair for the death of a gambler who had strung her along. And juries, drawn from that same public, could not bring themselves to convict her. Consider the sheer scale of the effort the state poured into breaking her, and how it failed. Nan Patterson was tried not once but 3 times. The first trial ended without a verdict when the case was disrupted. The second trial, the great set piece, ran for weeks and ended with the jury deadlocked, unable to agree. A third trial was mounted, and it too ended with a hung jury, the 12 men unable to reach the unanimous verdict the law required. 3 times the state of New York brought its full weight against one showgirl. 3 times it failed to convict her. After the third deadlock, District Attorney Jerome gave up. He announced that he would not try her a 4th time. Nan Patterson walked free. She had done what none of the men in these stories could do to the women they crushed. She had outlasted the state itself. Where Evelyn Nesbit could only testify to save someone else, Nan Patterson had faced the machinery of a murder prosecution head-on 3 separate times and worn it down to exhaustion. Whether she was innocent, as she always claimed, or a very cool head who had beaten a murder charge 3 times over, the newspapers never decided, and neither did any jury. The question of who fired the shot in that hansom cab has never been answered. The Florodora Sextet had made a peculiar kind of history. The 6 young women who sang the show's most famous number, all reportedly of the same height and figure, became national celebrities simply for their beauty and their matched charm. And it was said that every one of the original 6 married a millionaire. To be a Florodora girl was to be advertised to the wealthy men of America as the era's very ideal of desirability. Nan Patterson had stepped into that machine, and like Evelyn Nesbit, she learned that a famous face drew rich and dangerous men the way a lamp draws moths, and that the men who came were rarely free to marry the girls they pursued. The details the prosecution assembled were what made the suicide story so hard to swallow. Caesar Young was leaving. He had booked passage to Europe with his wife, a voyage meant to end the affair for good, and Nan Patterson knew it. On the morning of the sailing, she arranged to ride with him, and the pistol that killed him had been bought, the state argued, only the day before, from a pawn shop by a couple who matched the description of Patterson's own sister and her husband. A gun, purchased by the family the day before, the death did not fit a story of sudden, spontaneous suicide. It fit a story of a plan. Against that, District Attorney William Travers Jerome threw the full weight of the state 3 separate times, and 3 separate times a jury of 12 men refused him the conviction he wanted. But notice the price, because the price is the same as ever. Nan Patterson won her freedom and lost everything else. The notoriety that had saved her also finished her. She could not simply return to the stage as a star, not with a dead man's blood on her name. She faded, as these women faded, out of the headlines and into obscurity, remembered by history only as the girl in the hansom cab, the showgirl who beat the state and vanished. She had held real power, the power of a public that refused to convict her, and it had been enough to keep her out of the chair. It was not enough to give her back a life. Chapter 14. The Stage Mother and the Director. In Hollywood, a mother controlled every dollar her daughter earned, and the man her daughter loved turned up shot in the back. The mother was Charlotte Shelby, and her story carries this pattern out of the Gilded Age drawing rooms and into the bright new century of the movie star, where the power a woman held over another woman became the deadliest force of all. By 1922, The old world of chorus girls and robber barons had given way to a new machine for manufacturing fame, the motion picture industry, and it produced beauties on a scale the theatre never could. One of its brightest young stars was Mary Miles Minter, a golden-haired ingenue promoted as a rival to Mary Pickford, adored by audiences and paid a fortune for it. Minter was among the best-paid young performers in Hollywood, her innocent screen image worth enormous sums to the studios. But Mary Miles Minter did not control that fortune. Her mother did. Charlotte Shelby, born in 1877, was the archetype of the stage mother taken to its most extreme and controlling form. She had shaped her daughter into a star from childhood and had kept an iron grip on every part of the resulting empire. She managed Mary's contracts. She controlled Mary's money. She dictated Mary's schedule, her image, and above all, her romantic life. Every dollar the daughter earned flowed through the mother's hands. Mary Miles Minter, adored by millions, was in her own home a possession, managed and guarded by a woman who had turned her child into an income and meant to keep it. The power Charlotte Shelby held was different in kind from anything else in this film. Josie Mansfield had leverage over a man. Frances Hall had a fortune of her own. But Charlotte Shelby's power was control over another human being, her own daughter, and through that daughter, control of one of the great earning machines of early Hollywood. She was reported to have threatened violence before to protect that control, to have warned off at least one man who came too close to Mary. A mother who had built her entire life on the ownership of her daughter's career would defend that ownership against any threat. And in the winter of 1922, a threat appeared in the form of a courtly, well-liked film director named William Desmond Taylor. Taylor was a director at the height of the young industry, an elegant Anglo-Irish man of refined manners, popular in Hollywood society. Mary Miles Minter, 19 years old and starved for affection outside her mother's suffocating grip, fell for him. Whether Taylor returned the feeling in the way the smitten young star imagined is unclear, but Minter's infatuation was real and, to her controlling mother, intolerable. Here was a man threatening to take Mary's heart, and with it, potentially, Mary's obedience and Mary's fortune. Everything Charlotte Shelby had built rested on keeping her daughter under her control, and William Desmond Taylor was a crack in the wall. Mary Miles Minter's value to the studios ran into enormous sums for the era, the earnings of a top-ranked star at the height of the silent boom, and every dollar of it passed through Charlotte Shelby's hands. The mother was not merely managing a career, she was operating a fortune, and she guarded it the way a bank guards a vault, deciding who came near her daughter and who was turned away. On the morning of the 2nd of February, 1922, William Desmond Taylor was found dead in his bungalow in the Westlake district of Los Angeles, shot once in the back. The Hollywood murder that followed became one of the defining scandals of the age, and it was made worse by the chaos of the crime scene. Studio executives and associates reportedly reached the bungalow before or alongside the authorities, and in the confusion, evidence connected to the film colony's biggest names appeared and vanished. What did surface was damning to the women around Taylor. A love note from Mary Miles Minter was found in his home. Her nightgown, it was reported, was found in his bedroom. A locket with the photograph of the comedienne Mabel Normand, the last known person to see Taylor alive, was found among his things. The dead man's private life, and the women tangled in it, spilled out into the newspapers. Suspicion settled on Charlotte Shelby, and it never left her. The pieces fit too well. She had the motive. A mother enraged that a man had captured her daughter and threatened her control. She had a documented history of jealous, controlling behavior over Mary's suitors. And there were troubling financial signs. Most damningly, that a key alibi witness for Shelby was said to have received suspicious sums of money after the murder. Years later, the celebrated director King Vidor, who quietly investigated the case, reportedly came to believe that Charlotte Shelby had killed Taylor after finding her daughter at his home. Mary Miles Minter herself, in later life, could neither fully clear her mother nor bring herself to condemn her, and the two women's relationship never recovered from the shadow of it. The dead man himself was a mystery wrapped inside the mystery. William Desmond Taylor was not even his real name. He had been born William Cunningham Dean Tanner, an Irishman who had walked out of an earlier life and an earlier family in New York, reinvented himself entirely, and risen to the top of the film business under a name he had made up. His past was full of locked doors, and his household in the weeks before his death had been full of trouble too, including a former servant who had robbed him and vanished, and another who would be the one to discover the body. When Taylor was found shot on the morning of the 2nd of February, 1922, the list of people with some reason to be in his orbit was long and badly tangled. What turned a murder into an earthquake was the chaos that followed the discovery. In the hours before the police took full control of the scene, figures from the studio reportedly reached the bungalow and moved through it, and letters and objects came and went. By the time the investigation was properly underway, the scene had been compromised in ways that could never be undone. What survived pointed at the women. A tender note from Mary Miles Minter, her nightgown, a locket holding the photograph of Mabel Normand. The private lives of two of Hollywood's most bankable actresses spilled into the newspapers, and the studios, terrified for their investment, scrambled to contain the damage. The one person never seriously pursued through all of it was the controlling mother whose motive was the strongest of anyone's. But Charlotte Shelby, like Frances Hall, had the resources and the will to survive suspicion. No one was ever charged with the murder of William Desmond Taylor. The case remains officially unsolved to this day, one of Hollywood's great enduring mysteries. The evidence that might have convicted someone was lost or buried in those first chaotic hours, and Charlotte Shelby, whatever she did or did not do, was never made to answer for it in a court of law. The cost, once again, fell hardest on the women, and here it fell in a cruel and fitting way on the very daughter the mother had tried to keep. The scandal destroyed Mary Miles Minter's career. Her innocent screen image could not survive the revelation of the love note and the nightgown, and the studios dropped her. The controlling mother had killed, if the suspicions are right, to hold on to her daughter's fortune, and in doing so had helped to destroy that fortune forever. Mabel Normand's career, too, was badly damaged by her connection to the case. The men in the earlier stories died. Here, the man died, and the women's careers died with him, ruined by a scandal that a mother's possessiveness may have set in motion. Charlotte Shelby had held total power over her daughter, and that power, exercised to its terrible end, broke the very thing it was meant to protect. Chapter 15. The newspaper was the real court. These women could not vote and could not sit on the juries that judged them, yet they ruled the front pages of the whole country. That contradiction is the key to everything, and it is worth stopping before the final reckoning to understand the strange machinery that made 5 obscure or ruined women into the most watched people in America. Begin with how little these women held under the law. For most of the period this film covers, from Josie Mansfield in the 1870s to the killings of 1922, American women lived under enormous legal disability. The old doctrine of coverture, which held that a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's, still cast its long shadow. A married woman's property, in many times and places, was not fully her own. Women could not vote in national elections until the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, near the very end of this story. They could not sit on the juries that decided these cases. In the courtrooms where Nan Patterson and Francis Hall were tried, every juror weighing a woman's fate was a man. Women held almost none of the formal levers of power that the country reserved for its citizens. And yet these women dominated the era's most powerful new force, the mass press. Because at the exact time these killings unfolded, American journalism was being transformed into something it had never been before. The old newspapers of small circulation gave way to great illustrated dailies, selling hundreds of thousands of copies, then millions. Photography and cheap reproduction meant that a beautiful face could be printed and reprinted endlessly. Evelyn Nesbit's image circulated on postcards and magazine covers across the whole country before her name meant anything. By the 1920s, the tabloid had arrived. Papers like the New York Daily News and the Daily Mirror fighting savage circulation wars, feeding a hungry public a daily diet of sex, money, and murder. In that new world, a woman at the center of a killing was not a minor legal matter. She was a commodity worth more than gold. The papers discovered that nothing sold like a beautiful woman, a rich man, a secret love, and a corpse. Each of these cases became what the press itself christened a trial of the century, a phrase used so often it lost all meaning. The Thaw trial sold papers by the ton. The Hall Mills trial drew 200 reporters and special telegraph lines to a small New Jersey courthouse. The Nan Patterson case ran on the front pages for a year. The public could not look away, and the papers made certain they never had to. This is the deep engine of every story in this film. These women were tried twice. Once in a court of law before a jury of men, under a system that gave them few rights. And once in the newspapers, before the entire country, in a trial that never ended and never acquitted. The legal court could free Francis Hall, but the press convicted her in the public mind for the rest of her life. The legal court could commit Harry Thaw as insane, but the press had already made Evelyn Nesbit the girl in the red velvet swing forever. The verdict that mattered most was often not the one the jury delivered. It was the one the newspapers wrote. And the press applied a savage double standard, the same double standard that ran through the whole culture. A man's secret love was a private weakness, quietly managed. A woman's was a public crime, dragged into the light and punished. When Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills were murdered, it was the dead woman's love letters that were spread across the field and then across the newspapers. Her passion put on trial alongside her corpse. When Evelyn Nesbit testified, it was her ruin, not White's predation, that the country dissected. The private words of women, their letters and confessions and desires, were read aloud to strangers again and again, because a woman's intimate life was treated as public property in a way a man's never was. Look at the grim symmetry of it across all 5 stories, and the numbers that measured the frenzy. Josie Mansfield's letters helped drive a killing and then damned her in print. Eleanor Mills's letters were scattered at the murder scene and read to a nation. Mary Miles Minter's love note surfaced in a dead man's bungalow and ended her career. The same object, the private letter or note, appears in case after case, and every time it becomes the instrument of a woman's public exposure. The men who died took their reputations mostly to the grave. The women who survived carried their exposed private lives forever. There is one more cruelty in the pattern worth naming plainly. In every case, it was a woman's intimate life that was dragged into the light, and never fully the man's. Stanford White's predation became a footnote to Evelyn's ruin. Fisk's letters damned the mistress who kept them more than the baron who wrote them. Eleanor Mills's love letters were read aloud to the nation over her own murdered body. The men were mourned, or buried, or quietly forgiven. The women were exposed and remembered as the exposure. So we arrive at the paradox this whole film has been building toward. These women held almost no power that the law recognized. They could not vote, could not fully own, could not sit in judgment. And yet, for a season each, they held the most modern power of all, the power to command the attention of an entire nation. A chorus girl, a kept mistress, a rich man's wife, a showgirl, a stage mother. Each of them stood for a time at the exact center of the country's gaze, holding millions of people rapt. It was a power they never asked for and could not keep. But it was real, and it was a preview of a century in which the image of a woman would move markets and topple men. The transformation of the press had begun back in the 1890s, when the great publishers Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst waged a circulation war in New York so ferocious that it gave the era a name, yellow journalism. They learned that scandal, crime, and human drama sold papers by the hundreds of thousands, and they built newsrooms designed to manufacture excitement out of any tragedy at hand. By the time the tabloids arrived after the Great War, the New York Daily News in 1919, the Daily Mirror and the Evening Graphic a few years later, the formula had been perfected. Smaller pages, bigger photographs, shorter words, and an endless hunger for exactly the mixture of sex, money, and death that these 5 cases served up so perfectly. Set that new power beside the legal position of women, and the contradiction becomes almost unbearable. A woman in this period could not, in most places, serve on a jury, argue a case as a lawyer, or, in the earlier decades, vote for the officials who prosecuted her. She was, in the eyes of the law, a lesser citizen or no citizen at all. And yet the same society that denied her a seat in the jury box would put her face on the front page and hang on her every word. The press made these women enormous, precisely because the culture found them so fascinating and so threatening. The beautiful, dangerous women who stood where the money and the desire and the violence of the powerful all came together. They were powerless in law and irresistible in print, and the papers made a fortune from the gap between the two. The question that remains is what all of it meant. 5 men dead or ruined. 5 women left to carry the story into poverty, exile, suspicion, or silence. A pattern that repeated across 50 years with the reliability of a law of nature. What does it finally tell us about power, about money, about the men who thought they could buy a secret life, and about the women who paid for those secrets in blood and fame? That is the reckoning of the final chapter. Chapter 16. What the dead men left behind. Every one of these stories ends the same way, with the man in the ground and the woman left to carry what remained. Stanford White in his grave, and Evelyn Nesbit sinking into decades of struggle. Jim Fisk in his grave, and Josie Mansfield drifting to a lonely death in Paris. Caesar Young in his grave, and Nan Patterson vanishing into obscurity. Edward Hall in his grave, and Frances Hall living out her years under a permanent shadow. William Desmond Taylor in his grave, and Mary Miles Minter's career and her bond with her mother destroyed. 5 men dead. 5 women left to carry it. That is the shape of the whole thing, repeated 5 times across 50 years. Return to where we began, to a hidden apartment above a New York street and a swing hung on red velvet ropes. That swing is the truest symbol of everything this film has shown, because it was a beautiful thing built to hold a young woman for a rich man's pleasure, in a secret room the world was not supposed to see. It was the private life of the powerful, gilded and locked away, and it could not stay locked. The secret in that room got Stanford White killed, made Evelyn Nesbit the most famous woman in America, and then discarded her. Every story here is a variation on that one room, a secret love kept behind money and status that would not stay behind the door. Because here is the truth the whole film has been circling, the truth these 5 women paid to teach us. Money could buy a marriage, it could not buy silence. The American rich built their lives on a bargain, that wealth and name would purchase the marriage of status, and that love and desire could be kept quietly on the side, hidden and harmless. The bargain was a lie. Desire does not stay hidden. The letters get written, the affairs get discovered. And when the private truth of the powerful collides with the pride and property of the powerful, the collision does not stay private. It ends in gunfire, and then in open court, and then across every front page in the land. And when it ended, look at who paid, not the fortunes. The Thaw millions survived. The Stevens money survived. The studios rolled on. Look instead at the women. Evelyn Nesbit, who had held a man's life in her testimony, ended in failing films and addiction and a nursing home. Josie Mansfield, who had nearly broken a robber baron with his own letters, died far from home with her name a byword for the dangerous mistress. Nan Patterson, who had beaten the state 3 times, disappeared into nothing. Frances Hall kept her fortune and lost her good name for a century. Mary Miles Minter lost her career and her mother in a single stroke. Their power was real, but it was always borrowed, drawn from beauty, from secrets, from public sympathy, from a family's money, and every loan was called in when the shooting stopped. Yet do not mistake the cost for the whole story, because that would be to see these women the way their own era tried to see them, as victims and cautionary tales. They were more than that. Every woman in this film made moves. Evelyn Nesbit chose what to say on the stand and saved a man with it. Josie Mansfield chose to weaponize a rich man's words and made a titan tremble. Nan Patterson chose to fight the state to a standstill and walked out free. Frances Hall chose to meet a murder charge with the full force of her fortune and won. Charlotte Shelby chose, in her terrible way, to hold on to her daughter at any price. They were players, not pawns, in a game so rigged against them that simply reaching the center of it was an act of nerve. And in reaching that center, they changed something, though none of them meant to. Consider what they forced upon a country that would rather not have looked. Every woman who was told to stay decorative and silent, and instead stood at the heart of the nation's attention. Every woman whose private letters were read aloud to strangers, and who survived the reading. Every woman who was supposed to be a possession, a plaything, a wife who kept quiet, and who instead held a fortune, a jury, or a killing in her hands. They were tried in the newspapers before the country would let a woman speak in public at all. They were watched, hungrily and cruelly, and in being watched so completely, they made the nation see them. They dragged the hidden bargains of the American rich into the open, and they made the private power of women, for the first time, a public fact. That is the legacy these 5 unwilling women left behind, and it points straight at the world we live in now. We live in an age when the image of a woman can command the attention of millions in an instant, when a woman's word can bring down a powerful man, when the secret lives of the rich are exposed to a watching public as a matter of course. That world did not begin in our time. It began in a hidden room with a red velvet swing, in a townhouse full of a robber baron's letters, in a hansom cab on West Broadway, under a crabapple tree in New Jersey, in a bungalow in Los Angeles. It began with these women, who held power they were never meant to hold, and paid a price no man in their stories ever paid. Think again of the 5 of them, laid side by side the way this story lays them. The chorus girl who testified and was thrown away. The mistress who armed a killer and died in exile. The showgirl who beat the state and vanished into nothing. The wife who bought an acquittal and kept a shadow over her name for 100 years. The mother who destroyed the very daughter she had meant to keep. Not one of them chose the ending she received. But each of them, standing at the center of a killing the whole country could not stop watching, proved something that country was not yet ready to say out loud. They proved that a woman could hold the fate of powerful men in her hands. They proved that the private bargains of the American rich ran on the silence of women, and that the silence could break. Every letter read aloud, every secret spoken on a witness stand, every mistress who would not vanish quietly, every wife who would not be shamed into the background, chipped at a wall the powerful had built to keep their 2 lives apart, the public marriage and the private desire. These women did not set out to tear that wall down. Most of them were caught in it and crushed by it. But the country watched them being crushed, in numbers no earlier scandal had ever commanded. And in the watching, something shifted. The women the age tried to reduce to a warning became, instead, impossible to ignore. Evelyn Nesbit lived to be 82 years old, more than 60 years after the shots on the rooftop. Looking back across all of it, at the architect who took her and the husband who killed for her, and the fame that used her and threw her away, she is often quoted as saying that Stanford White was lucky because White was killed and her fate was worse. She lived. In those few words is the whole terrible truth of every woman in this film. The men in these stories died, and in dying they were finished with it. The women lived, and living, they carried the secret, the scandal, and the cost for the rest of their days. They married for money. They loved in secret. And the secret would not stay buried. Money could buy a marriage. It could never, for any of them, buy silence. If these are the stories you want, the women history tried to shrink into a scandal, then subscribe to Feminine Legacies and stay with us for the next one. And tell us in the comments, of these 5 women, which one do you believe truly held the most power? Which one paid the highest price for it? And where in the world are you watching from?